Okay, then hello everyone. I noticed that I was the only one who had apples in the title of the talk, so I tried to make this up and at least in the subtitle. And what I wanted to talk about today is not the red apple, but the white apples, because we are usually trained to look at the red apple, but I want to shift your attention to not the one who's doing wrong things or unethical things, but about others who are bystanders who notice that something's wrong or that another person does something wrong, but doesn't speak about this. And I organized the talk in these around these 8 sentences, so takeaway messages, and hopefully I find the time to go through all these statements. So the first statement is that silence can be detrimental, and I brought some pictures of cases where people remain silent and unethical behaviors or inefficacy or corruption went on. Although people noticed these wrongdoings for a long time, but because they remained silent, for example, more generations of soldiers, for example, went through harassment in the military, or pupils went through sexual abuse in schools or sports institutions. So these are examples from Germany, but these happens in other areas of the world as well. And you also see, for example, the case of corruption at Volkswagen, where people noticed that they were cheating, but didn't speak up about it. And we have these prominent cases, but we also have other cases where there are everyday issues. Every one of us go through such a situation maybe every day, that you disagree with your supervisor, or you think your colleague isn't working in the most efficient way. And so do you speak up about it, or do you not, or keep you remain silent? And mostly, and often in many cases, people remain silent. And what we find is that the research supports the assumption that this silence can be detrimental. For example, it can hamper individual and collective learning, and it makes it difficult to detect errors and malfunction at the early stage. It can marginalize minorities, and it can even have negative effects on the mental health of people who remain silent. And it's somewhat ironic, because people don't address critical issues because they think it's good for their well-being to remain silent. But what we found in our studies, in longitudinal studies, that the opposite is the case, that remaining silent, withholding your views, can also have a negative impact on your health. And so the next question is, why do people engage in silence? And usually I would wait a minute and let you think what you think that the motives are that people have for remaining silent, and maybe even what your motives were when you, the last time, you didn't speak up about things that you noticed that should be changed, and you didn't say a word. So the motives that appear most often in the research, you can see here. And I also tried to link them to the animation with the apples. And you can imagine that if you have an abusive supervisor, there might be people who are just afraid to speak up, or they may think that speaking up may not change anything at all. So they have a higher level of resignation. But there might also be people who usually like the supervisor, because usually he's a nice guy, but sometimes he gets angry and he shouts at other people. But you won't disturb the relationship with this person, so you do not say anything about it. Or other people might just remain silent because they have an advantage of the situation, because this person shouts only at the other guys, and you make a good living in the organization, so you do not speak up about these things. So there might a whole bunch of motives that people have for remaining silent. And what we found is that it is important, on one hand, that the effects of silence differs depending on the motives people have for remaining silent. And also the antecedents for remaining silent differs depending on the motives that employees have. So what are the factors that affect whether people speak up or not? And this looks like a complicated model, but actually it's quite easy to understand because it's some kind of a heuristic. So you can read it in lines. You see that you have different levels of factors that affect whether people speak up or not. And you have the individual level where you have employee traits, skills, or motives and perceptions of the context, and then they remain silent. But you have also effects on the team level. You have the team culture, the team structure, the learning history of the team, and leadership styles. And they may create a team climate which forces people or increases the tendency that people remain silent. And you can even have this effect on the organization level. And the example of Volkswagen, for example, I spoke about before, but also other organizations that media showed have such a climate and a culture of silence that people do not speak up and do not raise critical issues, but remain silent. And what you also see that you have cross-level effects, that you have a team level or organizational structure that affects individual level and team level silence. And you even have the societal level. And we see that whole societies, be they professional societies in the healthcare sector, or national societies that do not speak up about specific issues. We had this, sorry, with the treatment of indigenous people in some countries, that they have a year-long or centuries-long silence about these topics. They do not get raised. So you have the organization, and the organization is embedded in a societal level. So we have also influence factors on the societal level. So another point we need to consider is that silence differs depending on who did something wrong. And what we notice is that there are often very prominent people or members who contribute a lot to the effectiveness of the organization and to the performance of the organization, who do things that are not allowed to other members, and they get away with it. So you see here the examples of Jimmy Savile and also of Larry Nassar, the gymnastics doctor in the US gymnastics teams, and you see Harry Weinstein. So there are often people who are rather famous and very prominent figures. And we have two processes that contribute to the fact that people remain silent about the negative things that these people do. You have, on the one hand, you do not think that such prominent and important figures are involved in negative behaviors or negative things in the organizations. This is one thing. And the other thing is that often people are covered up, and very important persons of organizations are protected by higher ups and even by the community, so that their wrongdoings is not detected. Another thing we need to consider is that silence is not a one-off event, but a part of a process. So this process starts with the stimuli in the environment, that you notice that something's wrong. And if you do not notice this, then this process doesn't even start. So you need to become aware that the situations deserves you to speak up. So then you get into the stage that you interpret the situations as a latent voice episode. So that voice is an option, so that you are able to speak up. And if you notice that such a situation exists, you have to decide whether it's appropriate or not to speak up. So this decision is often based on cost and benefit thinking and evaluation of risks and opportunities in these situations. And if you decide that voice is the appropriate response, you need to have a decent motivation or enough intention to speak up, because just because you think that it's right to speak up, you may not want to invest the effort to speak up. So you see, this is a long process that also involves feedback loops from the responses that you have When you remain silent and everything goes smoothly, then you may tend to remain silent in the next time as well. So these are feedback loops that feed into the system. And you see also that this process, this individual decision-making, is influenced by factors of the person and also by factors of the environment. So if you have, for example, the opportunity to speak up. What we also know, and this is very nicely shown in the case study that I would strongly recommend by Leslie Perlow and Nelson Penning, who followed a startup company throughout the life circle, and they could show that this decision-making process of whether to speak up or not is embedded in a social environment, in social relations, and also in the organization. And what Perlow and Penning could show is that in the beginning, people want to preserve relationships. They do not want to offend others, and that's why they remain silent, even if they disagree with another person or have problems with other person's approach. But as this goes on, we have spiraling effects, so that the relationship gets worse and worse, and it's even less appropriate to address critical issues, to criticize this other person. And so what they found is that that the relationship which they wanted to protect and preserve got destroyed because they did not clear the air and did not address critical issues. And next to this relationship process, they also found that there's effectiveness and efficacy process, because people in this study at least wanted to finish their task. They wanted to get work done, and so they thought, oh, if I speak up now and address this issue, this will keep us from reaching our aims, and this will disturb the smooth operating of the process. So they remained silent, and the effect was that the problems piled up and get even more difficult to complete the task, so that they get caught into a speed trap where they need to work faster and harder because they need to make up for the problems that they didn't address. Another interesting concept in the area of silence research is the so-called spiral of silence effect, which was originally found by Elizabeth Neumann, who was a public opinions researcher. And what she found was that if people are in the majority position, they are more willing to express their view, they express their opinion, because they think they are in the majority position and they are more confident. And so the effect is that this opinion gets more frequently communicated. And the opposite effect is true for people who hold a minority position, because they do hesitate more to express their views. So they do not speak that often and that openly about their minority position. And so this minority position gets even more marginalized. So the spiral of silence effect is that the majority position is more heard, and the minority position gets weaker and weaker. So we have a self-fulfilling prophecy that at the end, people are less likely, for example, to speak up or mention a minority position. The almost last statement that I want to discuss is that silence is not always a conscious choice. What I told you before when I introduced this process model was that people elaborate on this decision. They think about costs and benefits of speaking up, and also consider what are the risks and what are the opportunities. But that's not always the case. That at times people jump to a decision. They bypass all this elaborate processing, but jump to the decision that speaking up is not appropriate. And this is rather new research here. And the reasons behind this are, on the one hand, evolutionary preparedness, that people are used to beware in a situation where a potential threat is present. So this is this so-called flight response to danger. But there's also a process that is learned in the early socialization, where people learn during school, for example, or with their parents early in life, that it's not appropriate to challenge an authority figure. So they take this early experience in to the workplace, and they have this learned response that people do not want to hear, for example, opinions of people low in the hierarchy, or that people who install the process might be offended if someone else criticizes them. So they develop these so-called implicit voice theories, which are cognitive schemas for how to behave in a situation that might require voice. And the funny thing here is, or not so funny thing, is that as a supervisor, you can be open to voice and you can install these voice opportunities, but people will not speak up because they cannot be reached by rational arguments, but they have this schemata. They may be not open to deliberate decision making. And we need to be aware of this as well. And the last point that I want to make is that silence has many faces, that this idea is based on the works of Albert Hirschman, who said that people have different opportunities to respond to critical issues at work, and that speaking up or voice is one option to change things. But people often behave in a different way. So they may remain silent because they are loyal to the organization. They may also remain silent and say, okay, if this is such an abusive supervisor, for example, then I will hold back my work efforts, work less, and still remain in the organization, but the issue is not dealt with. And also the case, what we heard in the other talks before, if people leave the organization, this also leaves the critical issue untouched. And the abusive supervisor or abusive coach will go on and stay in the organization and has the potential to be contagious and have more toxic influence on other people at work as well. So we need to be aware of this as well. Okay, these were the 8 points that I want to show you and discuss for reasons and conditions when people remain silent at work. And you see some of the slides of the papers I would recommend reading, but I think the most important thing is what you think of yourself of this topic. Thank you very much.